We're going to cover duplication of polygons, edges and points. If I go into tag mode and apply duplicate polygons, in fact will work on the points here. Inside the construction history we have an extrude op. Now certain options are grayed out depending on exactly what you've done. Now here we duplicated a point and therefore the duplicate polygons has been grayed out, but we still have access to the object component mode and that sort of thing. Additionally, we have the skirting ratio, as you can see exactly from where it starts, as well as the subdivisions. The skirting ratio is also available for edges. To have a look at the edges, if I go into edge mode here, and if I were to middle click on here, we can see the difference. If we were to have a look at the extrude op for this, you notice that we have a similarity in the options that are available. Just on the transform tab, as you can see, it's just for the scaling, rotation and translation. But here we also have a skirting ratio, the distance from which the edge is relative to the duplication, and again the same thing with the subdivisions. As a note, if I were to duplicate an edge on the very edge of an object here, and if I do extrude along an axis, same thing, you notice the difference is that the skirting ratio is at 0. So if I were to increase this, there we can see exactly what it's doing. So when it's at 0, it basically has extruded an edge straight up. Now we can do exactly the same thing with an edge on the inside as well. So if I were to extrude this as well, you can see that here I'm changing the skirting ratio to 0, but what in fact I have done there is really created a duplicated edge, because this side of the edge, if I were to select that and select that there, so in fact it's like two sides, and you'll notice this thick edge here, and that will indicate that we have essentially right here we have 3 polygons sharing one edge, which potentially can cause problems, but it's really as a guide. Now I've been duplicating these polygons, but I could very well have done an extrusion. If I were to go back and just delete, say, the edge here, select it again, and now I do, instead of a duplication, I do an extrusion, it's given me exactly the same options to begin with, but it would have given me here a value of 0 in the length. If I were to do the same with polygons, like so, if I were to duplicate or Control D, what it's done is created an extrude op with a 0 length. There's my length that I was changing there. I'm just going to undo that because I'm going to just use one polygon for now. So watch this. Control D, duplicate, and now I'm going to move it locally. So there we go. So what's the difference between that and an extrusion? Well, if I go back to my construction history, you notice I have a move operator in addition to my extrusion. My extrusion length is 0, but now if I go back and make a change, you can see that it has the move operator above it. Just going to undo this. If I were to go back to my extrusion here, instead of a duplication, it automatically puts that length offset in there for me. The other thing to note is if I add some subdivisions in here, and if I move this out, what I can also do is turn on things like make them duplicates rather than having them connected. So that's what that option does. So for the inset amount, often you want to be able to control the scaling of an extrusion. So if I were to go in here and just say grab this guy and extrude it, as it goes up here, you can see I can inset or outset the polygon, and I can also create the subdivisions for that inset. That stops me from having to scale in X and Z to sort of get the same effect. Now if I were to scale, you notice I can either scale say 50%, and that's happening per subdivision, so each time it's getting 50% smaller. If I take that off, it's for the whole extrusion that it's doing that, and that applies to all of these factors here. A couple of other things to note is that the skirting ratio has disappeared, for that is only available for points and edges, but we have the duplicate polygons, which is only available for polygons. We also have the inset, which is locked, and this is locked to a particular angle, so each time the 45 degrees, so if I take it as 10 degrees, there we go, that's per subdivision or the whole thing. See, per subdivision it's looking at this scaling. Let's just reduce that back to there, so now we can change that to say 20, so each one is going 20, incrementally 20, so that's why if I were to do say 45 or even 90, it goes crazy. When it comes to curves, we can also extrude along a curve, and this can be for both polygons and edges. So if I were to select an edge here and extrude along a curve, there we go, we're using that profile. Now as you've noticed, the curve doesn't actually have to exist anywhere near the final extrusion. There we go, it probably gives you a little bit of a better idea of exactly what is happening. If I were to do the extrusion on some polys now, it's going to take this one and this one. Let's see what we get. So often it's going to try and extrude in the same direction. And what we need to do is to auto-rotate, align the first tangent to Y, so like so. And it's also perpendicular at the moment. We can also take that off. If I put some more subdivs, probably get a bit of a better idea inside here. For the merging, if I have the extrusion and I want to try and merge them all into one direction, these are what the merge options are for. We can also play around with adjacent polygons as well. We also still have the inset amount across this as well. One thing to note is if I go to my top view here, is that this is relative to the points on this curve. So if I were to change the points, then obviously the relational modeling is going to update as well, including the start and end points like so. One thing it has no relation is the orientation, like so. And that's why you can draw it anywhere. If you want to change the orientation, you can always tag all of the points, and then perhaps if I tag here, start to manipulate them, that sort of thing. And sometimes you're wondering why you don't get an absolute symmetry, and that's because it's always going to be working off the local axis. If I'd have a look at the extrude op here, or if I go into my polygon, if I go into my visibility options and turn on the cluster reference frame, you can see the local orientation. So you can see the Z is down, the X is that way, and the Y is that way. If I were to select this guy, you can see that it's in fact the winding is exactly the same way. So it's a mirror image of this. So when we come to do our extrusion, they're both looking in opposite directions, but yet the winding is the same all the way around. So on one side to the other, you have the same winding. Something to bear in mind for when you're particularly doing extrusion along curves.